2 armored gunships turned the valley into a meat grinder, chewing rock and flesh with 30mm cannons. Down in the dirt, trapped men scream into broken radios, pinned against a crumbling retaining wall. Up on the ridge, a solitary sniper rests her cheek against the scorched composite stock of a Macmillan TAC-50. 3 armor-piercing incendiary rounds sit heavy in the steel magazine. Wind kicks coarse sand over the scope's glass. The math is a joke. The angle is absurd. Taking the shot guarantees a horrific death. She exhales a shaky breath, closes her eyes for a fraction of a second, and reaches for the elevation dial. The granite dug into Sarah's lowest rib, right where the body armor ended and soft tissue began. It was a dull, persistent ache that had started 14 hours ago and had now blossomed into a localized, throbbing fire. She didn't shift her weight. She didn't adjust the ceramic plate. Movement meant compromise, and compromise in this valley meant you didn't get to go home. It was 14:30 hours on day 3. The hide site was a shallow depression carved into the high ridgeline, draped in thermal-defeating netting and interwoven with dead scrub brush that crumbled into dust if you stared at it too hard. The space smelled aggressively human. It reeked of stale sweat trapped in synthetic base layers, the chemical tang of water purification tablets, and the acidic copper scent of unwashed skin baking in the sun. Beside her, Reyes breathed. He was a phenomenal spotter, a human calculator with a spotting scope. But right now, Sarah wanted to strangle him. He had picked up a sinus infection somewhere over the Atlantic, and every single exhalation ended in a wet, faint click in the back of his throat. Inhale, exhale, click. She ground her molars together. Grit crunched between her teeth. Sand was everywhere. It was in the threading of her elevation turret, coating the slick oil of her bolt, packed under her fingernails, and cemented in the corners of her eyes. "Wind is shifting," Reyes whispered. His voice was cracked, raw from dehydration. "Half value. Coming from the east now. 2, maybe 3 knots." "Copy," Sarah murmured. Her lips barely moved. They felt like dry leather splitting at the seams. She kept her dominant eye pressed near the ocular lens of the Leupold Mark IV. The valley floor was a bleached canvas of tans, browns, and blinding whites, distorted by a heavy layer of mirage that made the ruined mud brick compounds below look like they were submerged in running water. Her target area was a specific L-shaped building, 1,200 yards down and across the gorge. For 3 days, they had watched goats chew on trash. They had watched women carry plastic jugs of water. They had watched nothing of tactical value. The boredom was an active, heavy thing that crushed the chest. It wasn't the sharp adrenaline of the movies. It was the slow, agonizing decay of focus. Sarah's left calf was cramping. A sharp knot of muscle seized, demanding to be stretched. She ignored it. She focused instead on the reticle, letting the crosshairs float over the rippling image of a rusted-out Toyota truck sitting in the courtyard. Her mind wandered, rebelling against the discipline. She thought about the instep of her left boot, which was laced too tight, pinching a nerve. She thought about a leaky faucet in her apartment in Virginia Beach that she hadn't fixed before deployment. She wondered if the water damage would eat through the drywall by the time she got back. "Assault element is at the staging line," Reyes breathed, his eye glued to the spotting scope. "O'Connor is signaling. They're making the push when the sun dips behind the western ridge." Sarah blinked, forcing the mundane thoughts away. The lethargy instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy knot in her stomach. It wasn't excitement. It was dread. It was the sudden, oppressive realization that the waiting was over and the chaos was about to begin. She ran a thumb over the oversized bolt handle of the TC-50. The metal was burning hot. "Hold the wind," she said, her voice dropping an octave, tightening. "Holding," Reyes replied. Click. Below them, the shadows began to stretch across the valley floor. Long, jagged fingers of darkness reaching out to swallow the heat of the day. The transition from absolute silence to total catastrophe took exactly 4 seconds. Down in the valley, O'Connor's squad, 6 SEALs moving with the deliberate, agonizing slowness of men who knew every step could trigger a pressure plate, were crossing an open courtyard towards the L-shaped building. Through the glass, Sarah watched them as thermal signatures in the gathering dusk, ghostly silhouettes painting the mud walls. First came the sharp, dry crack of a single rifle shot. It didn't echo. The sound was swallowed by the dense clay of the surrounding buildings. Then the valley ripped itself apart. Muzzle flashes erupted from 3 different rooftops simultaneously, strobing like broken fluorescent lights. The heavy, tearing canvas sound of a DSK heavy machine gun chewed through the twilight. Tracers, bright, angry red lines of phosphorus, crisscrossed the courtyard, converging on the shallow ditch where O'Connor's team had thrown themselves. "Contact! Contact! Contact!" The radio earpiece jammed into Sarah's left ear, screamed with compressed, static-laced audio. It was Jenkins, the medic. He didn't sound composed. He sounded like a man watching the world end. "We are pinned. Heavy suppressing fire from the north and east. Davis is hit. I repeat, Davis is down. Target the DSK." Reyes snapped, his voice losing the sick crackle, instantly shifting into the flat, mathematical cadence of a spotter. "Second floor roof, building to the north of the courtyard. Range 1,320. Wind is full value, right to left, 5 knots. Up 12.5 MOA, left 1.2. Sarah's hands moved with autonomic precision. Dial up, dial left. She settled the crosshairs on the strobing muzzle flash. She didn't feel heroic. She felt nauseous. The smell of the hot sand was suddenly overwhelming. She took a breath, letting it out to the natural respiratory pause. The trigger was a glass rod. She applied 3 pounds of pressure. The TAC-50 roared. The concussion kicked up a localized dust storm in the hide site. The stock slammed into her shoulder with the force of a swinging baseball bat, driving the air from her lungs. Through the glass, she watched the massive half-inch piece of lead and copper arc through the sky, a tiny blur of displaced air. A second later, the muzzle flash on the distant roof vanished in a violent spray of pulverized cinder block. "Impact. Gun is down," Reyes said, coughing as the dust from their own muzzle blast choked the hide site. "Repositioning," Sarah muttered, racking the bolt. A brass casing the size of a cigar tube ejected, spinning through the air and clinking against the rocks. The smell of burnt gunpowder, sulfuric and sharp, flooded the small space. "Wait," Reyes said. His hand clamped down on her shoulder. The grip was bruised, desperate. "Listen." Sarah froze. Underneath the chaotic popping of small arms fire from the valley floor, there was a new sound. It wasn't a crack or a boom. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping. It felt less like audio and more like a change in the atmospheric pressure. The rocks beneath her chest began to vibrate in time with the sound. Thwack, 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 thwack. "Rotors," Sarah said. The word tasted like ash. From the southern end of the gorge, rising over the jagged ridgeline like prehistoric insects, came 2 Mi-24 hinds. They were massive, ugly machines, painted in dull, desert camouflage that made them look like flying chunks of the mountain itself. They didn't fly gracefully. They beat the air into submission. The sheer downdraft from their 5-blade main rotors kicked up a massive wall of brown dust on the valley floor, blinding the men in the ditch. "Guns, guns, guns!" O'Connor's voice broke over the radio, entirely stripped of its usual calm command. The lead hind dipped its nose. The underchin Yak B 12.7mm Gatling gun spun up with a mechanical shriek that cut through the distance, followed instantly by a solid beam of tracers pouring into the courtyard. The mud brick walls exploded. Chunks of clay and rock were thrown 50 feet into the air. "They're tearing them apart," Reyes said, his eye pulling away from the scope for a fraction of a second to look at the sky with his naked eye. The second hind banked hard, lining up a rocket run. Sarah lay frozen. The sniper rifle in her hands, capable of destroying an engine block at a mile, suddenly felt like a child's toy. You don't snipe a helicopter. You don't lead a target moving at 150 knots through three-dimensional space, while factoring in bullet drop, spin drift, and wind shear. "Command, this is Viper 2, O'Connor screamed over the net, the audio clipping with the roar of the choppers above him. "We are trapped. We cannot move. We need air support right fucking now, or we are dead in 3 minutes. "Viper 2, this is command," a flat, sterile voice replied, from a comfortable air-conditioned room somewhere miles away. "Fast movers are 20 mics out. Keep your heads down." 20 minutes. O'Connor's team didn't have 20 seconds. The second hind launched a pod of unguided rockets. A rapid-fire shh echoed across the gorge. The courtyard below turned into a blinding white inferno of high explosives. Sarah's stomach rolled violently. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead, stinging her eyes, mixing with the dust. She pressed her face back against the rifle. "Reyes," Sarah said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded thin, reedy, like a wire pulled to the breaking point. "Give me the Raufoss mag." Reyes didn't argue. He didn't tell her it was impossible. He simply reached down to his chest rig, unfastened a pouch, and pulled out a heavy steel magazine loaded with Mark II 11 rounds. Armor-piercing incendiary, designed to punch through light armor, fragment, and ignite. He slapped it into her outstretched hand. The metal was cold. She ejected the standard ball magazine and slammed the Mark II 11 mag into the well. She racked the bolt again, chambering a round that cost more than her first car. Through the scope, the valley was a blur of smoke, dust, and flashes. The hinds were circling in a classic figure-8 pattern. One would dive and fire, then pull up and bank away, while the second one dove to cover it. It was brutal, systematic, and entirely flawless. She watched the lead chopper bank. She could see the pilot through the armored glass of the tandem cockpit. She could see the exhaust ports venting black heat into the atmosphere. The machine was heavily armored on the bottom and sides to deflect ground fire. "Where?" Reyes asked. He was back on the glass. "You can't punch the belly armor, not at this angle." "I know," she said. Her hands were shaking. She stared at them, small tremors in the fingers. She hated herself for it. She forced her grip to tighten, crushing the pistol grip of the stock until her knuckles went white. "Rotor hub, or the pilot glass, if they bank hard enough toward us." Distance to the flight path is 1,400 yards. They are moving at roughly 80 knots on the egress, Reyes calculated, his voice a frantic monotone whisper. "You have to lead them by—" "Jesus, Sarah, you have to lead them by 50 feet. The drop is over 400 inches. The math isn't there." "Give me a wind read," she snapped, the irritation flaring up, overriding the panic. She didn't want to hear the math. The math meant her friends were going to die in a ditch. Crosswind is erratic, between 5 and 8 knots from the left. Updraft from the valley floor is going to push the round. It's a complete guess, Huck. It's a prayer. Then start praying, Clickboy, she muttered. She tracked the trailing hind as it finished its gun run and began to pull up, banking right to circle back around. As it banked, it exposed the top of the aircraft for a fraction of a second. The main rotor mast, a massive titanium and steel assembly connecting the blades to the transmission. She swung the heavy barrel of the TAC-50. The friction of the bipod feet dragging across the granite was deafening in her own ears. She looked through the reticle. She didn't aim at the chopper. She aimed into the empty blue sky, 3 mil dots high, 5 mil dots into the empty space ahead of the machine. It felt incredibly wrong. Her brain screamed at her that she was aiming at nothing. The hind kept turning, moving into the empty space she was watching. Breathe in, let it out. She saw the rivets on the fuselage through the mirage. She saw the exhaust heat distorting the tail rotor. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked. The blast sent a shockwave through her jaw. She didn't blink. She kept her eye open, forcing herself through the recoil to watch the trace of the bullet. A tiny ripple in the air bending toward the earth. Flight time was over 2 seconds. 1001. 1002. The round struck the hind high on the exhaust housing, just behind the rotor mast. A bright white flash of the incendiary compound ignited, invisible to the naked eye, but glaring through the optics. "High and back!" Reyes yelled. "You hit the cowling!" The hind didn't even flinch. It kept banking, oblivious to the fact that it had just been stung by a .50 caliber Hornet. "Fuck!" Sarah hissed. She racked the bolt. Her shoulder throbbed. The casing ejected, bouncing off Reyes's helmet. "He's flattening out, coming around for another pass," Reyes fed the data. "He knows we're up here now. He has to. That impact was loud enough. O'Connor, status!" Sarah keyed her mic with a desperate thumb press. "Jenkins is bleeding out. We are pinned behind the north wall. They're lining up for rockets." O'Connor's voice was ragged, defeated. "I have 2 rounds left in this mag," Sarah said softly, mostly to herself. The nausea was gone. The fear was gone. It was replaced by a strange, hyper-focused detachment. The world shrank to a circle of glass and the smell of burnt powder. She tracked the lead hind. It was hovering now, nose down, pivoting slowly to align its rocket pods with the exact coordinate of O'Connor's ditch. It was stationary. "Distance," she demanded. 1,100, hovering. Wind is still cross, maybe 6 knots. She adjusted the elevation turret without looking. She knew the clicks by feel. She aimed squarely at the reinforced glass of the pilot's canopy. The glass was designed to stop 12.7mm rounds. But a Rofos round wasn't just a bullet. It was a kinetic penetrator wrapped in high explosives. She squeezed the trigger. The second round launched. The recoil bruised the already tender flesh of her shoulder. 1001. 1002. The round hit the pilot's side canopy dead center. The Rofos nose deformed. The incendiary compound detonated against the armored glass, and the tungsten carbide penetrator core punched through the weakened surface like a needle through a balloon. Through the scope, Sarah saw the interior of the cockpit violently flash white, then immediately fill with crimson and black smoke. The massive machine jerked in the air, the collective abruptly dropping. The hind tilted forward, its nose dipping violently as the pilot slumped onto the cyclic controls. "Direct hit! Cockpit compromised!" Reyes shouted, spit flying from his lips. The crippled gunship pitched downward, losing altitude rapidly. It didn't explode in the sky. It simply lost the will to fly, careening nose first into the valley floor 300 yards away from the SEAL's position. The impact was a silent, blooming mushroom cloud of dirt and pulverized metal, followed a second later by a concussive shockwave that washed over the hide site, bringing the delayed, thunderous boom of the crash. "One down!" Reyes yelled, pounding a fist into the dirt. "Don't celebrate," Sarah grunted, racking the bolt back violently. The last heavy round slid into the chamber. "The wingman is pissed." The second hind, seeing its leader plow into the dirt, abandoned its rocket run. It pulled up hard, banking sharply toward the ridgeline, toward them. "He's looking for us," Reyes said, his voice dropping the enthusiasm, returning to dread. "He's sweeping the ridge." Through the optics, Sarah stared directly into the terrifying face of the remaining gunship. It was climbing, the massive rotors chewing the thin mountain air, the chin gun swiveling like a predatory eye, searching the rocks for the thermal signature of a sniper. She had one Rufos round left. The machine was coming straight at her. The sound of the remaining hind was no longer just a noise. It was a physical weight pressing down on the back of Sarah's neck. The rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the rotors swallowed the world. It vibrated through the granite beneath her chest, traveling up her ribs and rattling her teeth. The sheer mass of the approaching machine displaced the air, creating a swirling, erratic microclimate on the ridgeline that sent dead scrub brush cartwheeling over her sniper hide. "He has us," Reyes said. His voice was entirely stripped of the spotter's calm. It was the tight, reedy sound of a man looking at his own grave. "Thermal sweep. He's looking right at our heat signature." Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was constricted, dry as powdered chalk. The human body is hardwired with a desperate, evolutionary imperative to run from apex predators. Every nerve ending in her legs was screaming at her to stand up, turn around, and sprint blindly down the backside of the mountain. But her rational brain, the cold, heavily conditioned core that made her a SEAL, knew the truth. If they stood up, they died. The 12.7mm Yak-B chin gun would cut them into unrecognizable ribbons before they made it 3 steps. Their only cover was the optical illusion of the thermal netting and a shallow depression in the rock. The hind was climbing, banking left, nose pointed directly at their coordinate. It was 800 yards out and closing fast. Through the Leupold scope, the gunship filled the entire field of view. It was terrifyingly ugly. Strips of peeling desert paint revealed dark primer underneath. She could see the heavy rivet lines holding the armored plating together. She could see the black soot staining the exhaust ports, and she could see the 4 barrels of the chin gun slowly rotating upward, locking onto the ridge. "Wind is irrelevant," Reyes choked out, coughing on the dust. "Straight on, 600 yards, point of aim, point of impact." Sarah forced her breathing to slow. It was a jagged, artificial rhythm. Inhale through the nose, hold, let the reticle settle. The crosshairs danced. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so violently that it transferred the pulse right through her shoulder into the stock of the TAC-50, making the scope bounce with every beat. She ground her teeth, bearing down on the rifle, trying to muscle the weapon into stillness. 500 yards. The hind paused its forward momentum, transitioning into a slow hover. The nose dipped a fraction of a degree. "He's lining up the gun," Reyes whispered, shrinking into the rock beside her, making himself as small as biologically possible. A strobe light of pure violence erupted from the nose of the helicopter. The sound of the Yak-B firing wasn't a series of mechanical bangs. It was a continuous, deafening, tearing sound, like God ripping a sheet of canvas the size of the sky. The dirt 50 yards below their hide site exploded. A straight line of geysers marched rapidly up the slope. Heavy caliber rounds pulverized the granite. sending fist-sized chunks of razor-sharp shrapnel flying into the air. Something hit Sarah's helmet with the force of a hammer. Her head snapped back. Her vision went white for a fraction of a second, filled with bursting static. A sharp, hot pain sliced across her left cheekbone. She didn't check to see if she was bleeding. She slammed her eye back into the optic. The dust was blinding. The gunship was a ghost in a brown fog. "I have 1 round," she thought. 1 round. Make it count. She couldn't shoot the pilot. The angle was head-on, meaning the bullet would have to punch through the thickest part of the armored glass, which was specifically angled to deflect frontal impacts. She needed a mechanical failure. She needed the heart of the beast. She dragged the crosshairs up, past the strobing muzzle flashes, past the cockpit, up to the massive spinning blur of the main rotor hub. Beneath the blades sat the transmission block, a heavily lubricated complex system of gears holding thousands of pounds of torque. The line of fire was climbing the ridge, 40 yards, 30 yards. The air smelled like pulverized stone and cordite. She held the reticle right on the dark, oily mass of the transmission housing. She didn't gently squeeze the trigger. She pulled it with desperate, brutal force. The TAC-50 roared, a singular clap of thunder against the continuous ripping of the helicopter's gun. The rifle bucked hard, the recoil driving the bruised meat of her shoulder into the unforgiving stone. Through the scope, there was a tiny, brilliant flash of white-hot light against the steel housing of the rotor mast. For 1 agonizing second, nothing happened. The Hind kept firing. The line of exploding dirt reached 10 yards away. Then, the helicopter simply stopped working. The Raufoss round hadn't just punched a hole. The incendiary compound had detonated inside the transmission block, and the tungsten core had shattered the primary drive gear. The massive torque of the 5-blade rotor system suddenly had nowhere to go. With a horrific metallic shriek that echoed off the valley walls, the main rotor mast seized. The kinetic energy violently transferred to the fuselage. The massive machine snapped into a violent, uncontrolled spin. The chin gun fired wildly into the sky as the fuselage rotated beneath the dead blades. The Hind lost its lift instantly, dropping out of the sky like a 60-ton brick of iron. It plummeted toward the canyon floor, spinning sickeningly, the tail rotor overcompensating and tearing itself apart from the stress. It hit the ground 400 yards below the ridge. There was no cinematic fireball. There was a sickening, bone-jarring crunch of crumpling metal, followed by the high-pitched whine of a failing turbine engine whining down into silence. A massive cloud of brown dust plumed outward from the impact site, rolling over the ruined mud brick compounds. Silence did not return to the valley. Instead, the absence of the helicopters was replaced by a high-pitched electronic ringing that drilled into the center of Sarah's brain. She lay frozen, her cheek glued to the stock of the rifle, her finger still rigid against the trigger guard. She wasn't breathing. Her lungs felt like they had been filled with wet cement. "Huck!" Reyes gasped. She didn't move. She just stared through the scope at the rising dust cloud, waiting for the dead machine to somehow rise from the dirt and kill them. Reyes reached out, his hand shaking violently, and grabbed her shoulder, shaking her hard. "Sarah, breathe! It's down! It's fucking down!" Sarah gasped, a sudden ragged intake of air that tasted like sulfur and crushed rock. She rolled onto her back, breaking her position for the first time in hours. The sky above was a fading, bruised purple, indifferent to the carnage below. The adrenaline dump hit her like a physical blow. Her hands began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She looked at them, detached, as if they belonged to someone else. The trembling moved up her arms, into her chest, and suddenly her stomach heaved. She rolled onto her hands and knees and dry heaved into the dust. Nothing came up but a mouthful of bitter, acidic saliva. Her body was revolting against the stress, purging the chemical cocktail that had kept her hyper-focused for the last 10 minutes. She spit into the dirt, wiping her mouth with the back of a filthy glove. Her left cheek stung sharply. She touched it. Her glove came away smeared with dark, drying blood. A piece of shrapnel from the Heinz gun run had sliced her face, a shallow but bleeding gash just below her eye. "You hit?" Reyes asked, his voice still reedy, but the panic was receding, replaced by the clinical concern of a teammate. "Just a scratch," she croaked. Her voice sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together. She sat back on her heels, forcing herself to look at the rifle. The bolt was closed on an empty chamber. The magazine was empty. She reached down, her trembling fingers fumbling with the magazine release, and dropped the heavy steel box. She pulled a fresh magazine of standard ball ammunition from her rig and seated it with a sharp smack. The mechanical action grounded her. Load, lock, scan. It was muscle memory overriding biological terror. A sharp smell wafted up the ridge on the shifting thermal winds. It was the thick, acrid stench of burning aviation fuel, mixing with the metallic smell of hot engines cooling in the dirt. Reyes was already back on the radio, pressing his headset tight against his ear. "Viper 2, this is Overwatch. Both birds are down. Repeat, airspace is clear. Status, over." Static hissed in Sarah's earpiece. It felt like an eternity before the channel keyed open. "Overwatch, this is Viper 2, O'Connor's voice came through, exhausted, broken but alive. "We copy. Both birds down. Good shooting, Huck. Good fucking shooting." Sarah closed her eyes, letting her head drop. She didn't feel pride. She felt a hollow, aching emptiness. "Status on casualties?" Reyes asked, his pen already out, ready to write on the small whiteboard strapped to his forearm. "Davis is bad," O'Connor said. The background noise on the radio was a chaotic mix of frantic whispers and the ripping sound of Velcro from a medical kit. "Femoral artery is compromised. Jenkins has a tourniquet high and tight, but he lost a lot of blood before we could get to him. We need a medevac yesterday." "Command is tracking," Reyes said. "Fast movers are on station in 5. Dust-off is 20 mics out. You need to secure an LZ. "We can't move him far," O'Connor replied. "The courtyard is a crater. We'll pop smoke in the clearing south of the compound. We still have enemy infantry in the sector. Those Heinz scattered them, but they'll be regrouping." "Copy," Reyes said. He looked over at Sarah. "We need to get down there. They have no long gun. If the local fighters push them while they're waiting for the bird, they won't hold." Sarah nodded slowly. The idea of standing up, of putting weight on her cramping legs and navigating the treacherous, steep descent into the valley, felt impossible. Her body was a map of dull aches and sharp pains. The bruised shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heartbeat. "Pack it up," she said, her voice finally stabilizing. She didn't break down the TAC-50. There was no time for the hard case. She simply folded the bipod legs and slung the massive 30-pound rifle across her back. The webbing of the sling bit instantly into her collarbone, a familiar, punishing weight. Reyes collapsed the spotting scope, shoving it into his assault pack. They didn't bother pulling down the thermal netting. The hide was compromised anyway. Anyone looking at this ridge knew exactly where the shot came from. Sarah took one last look at the sniper hole. It was just a depression in the rocks, littered with brass casings, empty water bottles, and the lingering smell of fear. It had been their whole world for 3 days. "Let's go," she said. The descent was an exercise in controlled falling. The backside of the ridge was a steep, unforgiving slope covered in loose shale and scree. Every step required absolute focus. Plant the boot, test the weight, slide, catch balance, repeat. Under normal circumstances, it would be a grueling hike. Doing it in full body armor, carrying a massive anti-materiel rifle, with legs shaking from an adrenaline hangover, was pure torture. The heat radiating from the rock was stifling. As they dropped lower into the valley, the wind died entirely, trapping the stagnant, baking air between the canyon walls. Sarah could feel the sweat pooling at the small of her back, soaking through her combat shirt. Her knees popped with every downward step. The cartilage felt like it was grinding into dust. She didn't speak to Reyes. There was nothing to say. The silence between them was the heavy, shared quiet of two people who had just stepped back from the edge of a cliff. They moved laterally across the slope, utilizing the deep shadows of the jagged rock formations to mask their descent. Below them, the valley floor was a chaotic tapestry of destruction. As they closed the distance to the village, the scale of the violence became sickeningly apparent. From 1,000 yards through a scope, it looked like a video game. Up close, it was a butcher shop. The mud brick walls of the compound, which had stood for perhaps 100 years, were reduced to mounds of pulverized clay and splintered wood. The ground was pitted with deep, ragged craters from the rocket pods. The air was thick with a noxious cocktail of smells: raw sewage from ruptured pipes, the sharp tang of high explosives, and the unmistakable, metallic scent of fresh blood. They found O'Connor's team huddled in a deep, reinforced irrigation ditch that ran along the southern edge of the ruined courtyard. Sarah slid down the embankment, her boots kicking up a small avalanche of dry dirt, and dropped into the trench. The atmosphere in the ditch was grim. 4 SEALs were pulling security, their rifles resting on the dirt berm, their eyes scanning the darkening ruins for any movement. Their faces were coated in a thick mask of pale dust, making their eyes look bloodshot and unnaturally bright. At the bottom of the ditch, Jenkins was working on Davis. Sarah knelt beside them, letting the heavy barrel of the TAC-50 rest on the dirt. Davis looked terrible. The skin on his face was the color of dirty wax, entirely devoid of blood. His lips were a pale, bruised blue. A tourniquet was ratcheted down brutally tight-high on his right thigh, biting deep into the uniform fabric. The ground beneath his leg was a dark, saturated red mud. "How is he?" she asked softly. Jenkins didn't look up. His hands were slick with blood, frantically packing combat gauze into a secondary wound on Davis's calf. "He's in hypovolemic shock. I've pushed fluids, but he's leaking too fast. The tourniquet is holding the main artery, but the rocket shrapnel chewed up his lower leg pretty bad. He needs whole blood, and he needs a surgeon." O'Connor slid down the berm, crouching next to Sarah. He looked 10 years older than he had 3 days ago. There were dark, heavy bags under his eyes. "The fast movers are on station," O'Connor said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They're circling at 15,000, waiting for targets. Dust-off is 10 minutes out." He looked at Sarah, then looked up at the massive silhouette of the TAC-50 slung over her back. "I don't know how you made those shots, Huck," he said quietly. There was no bravado in his voice, just a profound, exhausted gratitude. "I really don't." "Math," Sarah lied. She didn't want to explain that it was desperation, a wild guess, and a terrifying amount of luck. "Just math." O'Connor nodded, though his eyes suggested he knew better. He gestured toward the north end of the village. "The first hind is in pieces over there. The second one, the one that almost took you off the ridge." "Where?" Reyes asked, dropping his pack and pulling his M4 rifle to his chest. "About 300 yards west," O'Connor said. "It ploughed into a dry riverbed. It's not burning. I don't know if anyone survived the crash, but we haven't taken any fire from that direction." Sarah shifted her weight. The burning in her shoulder flared up, a sharp reminder of the recoil. She unslung the sniper rifle, resting the bipod on the lip of the trench. "I'll watch the riverbed," she said. She settled in behind the scope, wiping a layer of fine dust off the objective lens with the soft fabric of her sleeve. It was a mundane, grounding ritual. Through the optics, in the rapidly failing light, she found the wreckage of the second hind. It was a mangled heap of unrecognizable metal. The tailboom was snapped cleanly in half, folded over the main fuselage. The rotor blades were shattered, scattered across the dirt like broken matchsticks. The armored canopy was crushed inward. She stared at the dead machine. She had killed it. A piece of metal the size of her thumb, propelled by expanding gases, had defeated a 60-ton instrument of war. It felt surreal. The disconnect between the tiny pull of her trigger finger and the massive, catastrophic destruction in the valley below was hard to reconcile. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a technician who had just completed a very dirty, very loud job. A sudden, deep roar shook the sky above them. It was a tearing sound, entirely different from the helicopters. 2 FA-18 Hornets streaked low across the valley, moving so fast that the sound of their engines trailed seconds behind them. They dropped flares, bright, burning magnesium stars that illuminated the darkening valley in a harsh, white glare, before pulling up hard in a vertical climb. "Show of force," O'Connor muttered. "Better late than never." "Dust off is 2 minutes out," the radio man called from down the trench. "They see the strobe. They're coming in hot." Sarah kept her eye to the scope, watching the mangled wreckage of the helicopter. The flares cast long, distorted shadows across the metal. Nothing moved. There was no enemy infantry rushing the ditch. The sheer violence of the helicopters and their subsequent destruction had shattered the morale of whoever was left in the village. For the first time in 3 days, the tension in Sarah's chest began to uncoil. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like an internal structural collapse. The adrenaline was entirely gone, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion that settled deep into her marrow. She listened to the approaching, rhythmic thumping of the Medevac Blackhawk. It was a softer, faster sound than the hinds. It was the sound of going home. She didn't lower her rifle. She kept her cheek resting on the warm composite stock, the smell of gunpowder and hot dust clinging to her uniform. She watched the valley fade into complete darkness, waiting for the helicopter to land, waiting for the dust to rise one last time. The Medevac Blackhawk did not approach with the predatory grace of the gunships. It came in fast, low, and heavy, its twin engines screaming in a pitch that rattled the loose fillings in Sarah's molars. "Dust off is on the deck, 30 seconds, the radio man barked over the net. The rotors beat the stagnant valley air into a violent, suffocating cyclone. The dirt in the trench rose up, an aggressive brown fog that coated the back of Sarah's throat with the taste of ancient, pulverized feces and dried clay. She kept her right eye squeezed shut, her left pressed against the rubber cup of the optic. The crosshairs floated over the mangled remains of the second hind. She watched for a twitch, a shadow, a survivor crawling from the wreckage with an RPG. Nothing. The valley was utterly dead. Move him now!" O'Connor's voice was barely a croak over the deafening downwash. They hauled Davis up the steep dirt wall of the irrigation ditch. It was not a clean, synchronized lift. It was clumsy and desperate. Jenkins slipped, his boots losing purchase on the slick, blood-soaked mud beneath Davis's shattered leg. Davis let out a sound, not a scream, but a wet, rattling gasp that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. The tourniquet had held the femoral artery, but the movement was forcing dark, venous blood to spill from the jagged tears in his calf, painting the dirt black in the failing light. "Covering!" Reyes yelled, his M4 shouldered, scanning the jagged ridgeline above them. Sarah didn't move. Her world remained confined to the circular, green-tinted field of her night vision, which had just flipped down over her optic. The thermal signatures of the rocks were beginning to bleed together as the desert cooled, turning the landscape into a ghostly, low-contrast smear. The Black Hawk flared directly over the courtyard, dropping like a stone. The wheels slammed into the dirt with a bone-jarring thud. The side doors were already pinned back. A pararescue jumper hung out the side, tethered to the ceiling, screaming something incomprehensible while waving them forward frantically. "Go, go, go!" O'Connor shoved Jenkins forward. 4 men carried Davis like a piece of broken furniture, stumbling through the knee-deep craters and debris of the courtyard. The rotor wash tore at their gear, whipping loose radio antennas and unfastened nylon straps. Sarah finally pulled her face from the rifle. She folded the bipod legs with a sharp smack. The metal burned her fingers. She slung the weapon, the 30-pound mass settling back into the deeply bruised groove on her collarbone. She ran. Her legs didn't feel like legs. They felt like heavy wooden pegs. Her knees screamed, grinding against depleted cartilage. Every step sent a shockwave up her spine. The air smelled entirely of JP-8 jet fuel and hot exhaust, an industrial stench that chemically burned the inside of her nose. She hit the metal ramp of the Black Hawk just as Reyes threw himself into the cabin. The deck was slick. She almost went down, catching herself on a webbed seat, her glove smearing across a fresh pool of Davis's blood. "Up! We're up!" the flight medic screamed into his helmet comms. The deck lurched. The Black Hawk didn't gradually lift off, it was yanked into the sky. Sarah's stomach dropped into her boots. She collapsed onto the metal floor, grating, wrapping her arms around the heavy barrel of the TAC-50, pulling it tight against her chest so it wouldn't become a flying bludgeon. The valley floor fell away. The dark, jagged teeth of the mountains swept past the open side doors. The transition was violent. 1 second, they were buried in the dirt, waiting to be ground into meat. The next, they were suspended in the freezing, turbulent air, looking down at a world that had tried so desperately to keep them. Sarah leaned her head back against the vibrating aluminum fuselage. The vibration chattered through her skull. She closed her eyes. The adrenaline was draining out of her system, leaving a toxic sludge in its wake. Her left cheek began to throb. The shallow shrapnel cut had clotted, drying into a tight, pulling crust on her skin. She reached up, running a thumb over the edge of it. It stung sharply. Across the small cabin, bathed in the sickly green glow of the instrument panels, the medical team was working on Davis. It was a frantic, chaotic choreography of tearing Velcro, snapping plastic, and desperate shouting. They were hanging a bag of whole blood, the dark red liquid swaying violently with the pitch of the helicopter. Jenkins sat slumped against the far wall, his hands resting in his lap. They were coated to the wrists in drying blood, looking like heavy, dark gloves. He was staring at the deck, his eyes wide and utterly vacant. Nobody was cheering. Nobody was clapping Sarah on the shoulder. She had killed 2 heavily armored gunships with 3 bullets. She had pulled off a ballistic miracle that would be written into training manuals for the next 50 years. But sitting in the freezing, vibrating tin can, shivering violently in her sweat-soaked combat shirt, she didn't feel victorious. She felt like a mechanic who had barely managed to patch a blown tire before the whole car went over a cliff. The flight to the forward operating base was 40 minutes of sensory deprivation and physical misery. With the side doors pinned open, the ambient temperature in the cabin plummeted to near freezing. The wind whipped through the compartment, instantly turning the sweat trapped beneath Sarah's body armor into a layer of ice. She shivered so violently that the heavy rifle cradled in her lap rattled against the floor grates. She watched Reyes. He was sitting opposite her, a torn wool blanket pulled tight over his shoulders. His face was a mask of pale dust, broken only by the clear tracks of sweat that had run down from his temples. He looked up, catching her eye. He didn't smile. He just gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement of survival. Nothing more. The romanticized idea of the brotherhood, of high fives and shared whiskey after a near-death experience, was a myth sold to recruiters. The reality was a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the collective realization of how close the margin had been, and the horrifying knowledge that the margin was entirely out of their control. Beside Reyes, O'Connor was speaking into his headset, coordinating with the Tactical Operations Center. His face was bathed in the harsh red light of the cabin roof. He looked haggard, his jaw set in a rigid line of suppressed anger. Men like O'Connor hated being pinned down. They hated relying on luck, and today they had relied almost entirely on luck. Sarah's shoulder was a localized disaster area. The TAC-50 was a beast. Even with the massive muzzle brake redirecting the expanding gases to mitigate recoil, firing 3 armor-piercing incendiary rounds in rapid succession from an awkward, prone position had done serious kinetic damage. She could feel a deep, hot swelling beneath her clavicle. Every time the helicopter banked, shifting her weight against the strap of her plate carrier, a sharp, white-hot spike of pain lanced down her bicep. She was almost certain she had a hairline fracture in her collarbone. She shifted, trying to relieve the pressure, and her boot kicked something metallic. It was an empty brass casing. It rolled across the corrugated floor of the cabin, the dull yellow metal catching the green light. One of the medics must have kicked it off their gear. Sarah stared at it. Her mind, utterly devoid of the chemical focus that had sustained her on the ridge, began to loop. It played the tape back, not in sequential order, but in fragmented, intrusive flashes. The strobing muzzle flashes of the chin gun, the smell of Reyes's stale breath, the metallic shriek of the seizing rotor mast, the sickening crunch of the first helicopter ploughing into the dirt. She squeezed her eyes shut, digging the heels of her hands into her eye sockets until bursts of static color exploded in her vision. "Hey!" A voice cut through the drone of the engines. She opened her eyes. O'Connor was leaning over, a foot away from her face. The wind whipped his voice away, so she had to lean in to hear him. "You good?" he asked. The question was a formality. He didn't care about her emotional state. He was taking inventory of his remaining functional assets. "Fine," Sarah shouted back. Her throat was raw, the single syllable scraping like sandpaper. O'Connor looked at the massive rifle in her lap, then up to the dried blood smeared across her left cheek. "Doc is going to need to clean that out when we land. Don't let them brush it off. That dust is toxic." "I know." "Command is already asking for a debrief," O'Connor continued, his expression hardening. "Some brass in an air-conditioned tent wants to know how a single sniper took down 2 Hinds. They think it's a structural flaw in the airframe. They want to exploit it." Sarah let out a short, bitter laugh that felt like a cough. A structural flaw. The flaw wasn't in the airframe. The flaw was that she had been terrified enough and desperate enough to try a shot with a single-digit probability of success, aiming into empty space, betting on erratic wind calls, and a Rufos round behaving perfectly upon impact. "Tell them to aim for the transmission housing," Sarah yelled back, the cynicism finally bleeding into her voice. "And tell them to have an angel riding the bullet." O'Connor gave a grim, tight-lipped smile. He patted her good shoulder, a solid, heavy thump, and sat back against the bulkhead. The helicopter banked sharply, the nose pitching down. Through the open door, the sprawling, ugly expanse of the FOB appeared. It was a massive, scarred patch of earth surrounded by concrete T-walls, lit up by blinding halogen floodlights that cut through the darkness like interrogators' lamps. They were back in the sterile world, the transition from the wild, chaotic violence of the valley to the hyper-regulated, fluorescent-lit environment of the forward operating base was a brutal psychological whiplash. It felt like stepping out of a slaughterhouse and directly into a corporate office. The Black Hawk's skids hit the flight line tarmac with a heavy, scraping thud. Before the massive overhead rotors even began to spool down, a trauma team was already swarming the bird. They materialized from the dark like a pack of sterile wolves, ducking under the spinning blades, shouting over the deafening whine of the turbine engines. They dragged a collapsible wheeled litter up to the cabin door. Sarah sat on the metal floor grating, her arms still wrapped protectively around the TAC-50. She watched them haul Davis out. He was entirely slack, his uniform heavily stained with dried mud and fresh, dark arterial blood. Someone hung an IV bag from a carabiner clipped to the litter, the clear fluid mixing with a second bag of thick, dark, whole blood. Jenkins followed them down the ramp. He didn't look like a Tier 1 operator. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of a man, his boots dragging against the concrete, his hands still painted in his teammates' blood. Sarah stood up. The concrete of the flight line felt aggressively flat. Her inner ear was still compensating for the erratic pitch and yaw of the helicopter, and the sudden stability made the horizon tilt violently. She staggered, catching her balance by driving the heavy, rubberized buttstock of her rifle into the deck. The air here didn't smell like survival. It smelled like military bureaucracy. It was a thick, industrial cocktail of burning diesel fuel, raw sewage baking in the open treatment ponds, and the sharp, chemical odor of bleach radiating from the nearby latrines. Armory first, then medical, then the debrief, O'Connor ordered. He was walking past her, his voice devoid of any inflection. He wasn't the man trapped in the ditch anymore. He was already rebuilding his armor, shifting rapidly from a desperate squad leader back into a cold, calculating administrator. The walk to the armory was an agonizing half-mile trudge across crushed gravel. The FOB was a small city that never slept. Civilian contractors in clean, tan tactical pants walked by carrying clipboards and insulated coffee mugs. Mechanics turned wrenches on armored vehicles under blinding halogen floodlights. None of them looked twice at the filthy, blood-smeared team dragging themselves past the chow hall. In this place, catastrophic exhaustion was just the baseline uniform. Inside the armory, the air conditioning was cranked to a freezing 65 degrees to keep the sensitive optical equipment and radios from degrading. The sudden blast of cold air bit through Sarah's sweat-soaked combat shirt. Her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, a violent, percussive clicking in the back of her skull. She walked toward the clearing barrel, a rusted 50-gallon drum painted bright red, filled to the brim with sand, sitting at a 45-degree angle. It was a mandatory safety ritual, a mechanical process designed to prevent exhausted men from blowing holes in the plywood walls. She stared down at the red drum. Her hands felt numb, thick, and stupid. Dropped the magazine. She pressed the heavy, grooved release catch. The steel box slid out and fell heavily into her palm. She shoved it into an empty dump pouch on her rig. Rack the bolt. She reached over the optic and grabbed the oversized bolt handle. She had to pull it twice. Her shoulder, deeply bruised and radiating a sharp, hot pain down her bicep, refused to generate the necessary leverage on the first try. On the second pull, the massive bolt slid back with a heavy metallic clack. The chamber was already empty. "Inspect the breach." She jammed a filthy, calloused finger into the chamber, feeling the cold, machined steel to ensure no brass casing was lodged inside. "Point in a safe direction. Pull the trigger." She shoved the massive muzzle brake deep into the sand of the barrel and squeezed the trigger. Click. The sound of the firing pin dropping on an empty chamber echoed off the concrete walls. It was the loudest, emptiest sound she had heard all day. She signed the weapon back into the logbook. Her handwriting, usually a tight, disciplined script, was a jagged, illegible scrawl. Her fingers were trembling so violently she could barely keep the pen on the paper. The armourer, a bored 20-year-old kid, wearing a clean uniform and listening to music through one earbud, took the massive rifle from her without looking her in the eye. He slid it onto a reinforced steel rack. Walking out of the armory without the 30-pound weapon made Sarah feel dangerously light. The sheer absence of the weight threw her centre of gravity off. It felt like a phantom limb had been severed. Without the rifle, she wasn't a sniper anymore. She was just a tired woman in a dirty shirt. At the medical tent, a Navy corpsman with deep bags under his eyes forced her to sit on an examination table covered in crinkling sanitary paper. He took one look at the jagged gash on her left cheek and pulled out a coarse, iodine-soaked sponge. He didn't warn her. He just started scrubbing. The pain was a white-hot flare that made her eyes water. It hurt substantially more than the actual shrapnel impact on the ridge. The iodine burned deep into the raw tissue, aggressively eating away the pulverized granite and gunpowder residue embedded in the wound. "You need a stitch in this," the corpsman mumbled, shining a penlight directly into her pupils to check for a concussion. The light stabbed into her optic nerve, triggering a dull ache at the base of her skull. "Steri strips," Sarah counted, her voice sounding like two pieces of rough grit sandpaper rubbing together. "I'm not sitting here for stitches." The corpsman sighed, recognizing the immovable stubbornness of an operator who just wanted to be left alone. He squeezed a thick line of surgical glue over the wound, holding the edges of the split skin together with his thumbs before applying 3 butterfly bandages. "Your left shoulder is a mess," he noted, pressing a thumb against the swollen mass of tissue beneath her collarbone. She flinched, pulling away sharply. "Extensive capillary damage, deep tissue contusion. Keep ice on it. Take 800 milligrams of Motrin every 6 hours. Ice and Motrin, the universal military cure for everything from a torn meniscus to a traumatic brain injury. "Thanks, Doc," she muttered, sliding off the paper-covered table. The debriefing was exactly the bureaucratic nightmare she had anticipated. She was directed into a small, windowless room made of raw plywood. The air was thick and stagnant, smelling heavily of stale black coffee, ozone from a running server tower, and cheap deodorant. 3 intelligence officers sat behind a folding table. 2 wore pristine uniforms. 1 wore civilian clothes and had a wad of chewing tobacco packed deep into his lower lip. They didn't ask her how she was feeling. They didn't ask about the ringing in her ears or the blood on her boots. They wanted the magic formula. "Chief," the civilian contractor started, tapping a pen against a yellow legal pad. "We need to understand the ballistics on those 2 engagements. We're looking at a single sniper taking down 2 heavily armored Mi-24 airframes. Command thinks there might be a structural flaw in the transmission housing that we can exploit for future engagements. Walk us through the math." Sarah stared at the whiteboard behind them. Walk us through the math. The math was a joke. The math said she should have missed by 20 feet. The math said that a crosswind sweeping up a canyon wall at an unpredictable velocity, combined with a target moving in 3-dimensional space at 80 knots, meant the bullet had a 0.01% chance of hitting anything vital. They wanted to turn a desperate, lucky shot born from absolute, pant-wetting panic into a repeatable tactic. They wanted a neat little equation they could put in a PowerPoint presentation for a general in Washington. She looked at the intelligence officers. They were waiting, pens poised. So she lied to them. She gave them numbers that sounded professional. She fed them windage calculations that sounded mathematically sound. She talked about leading the target by precise mil-dot increments based on the estimated velocity of the aircraft. She didn't tell them that she aimed into empty, blank sky. She didn't tell them that her hands were shaking so badly she almost pulled the shot off target before the sear broke. She didn't tell them that she had squeezed the trigger while utterly, fundamentally convinced she was about to be turned into a fine red mist by a chin-mounted Gatling gun. Let them have their hero story. Let them put the fake math on their slide deck. The truth was too messy, too reliant on a blind roll of the dice for them to ever digest. It was 0200 hours when she finally pushed open the heavy wooden door to her hooch. It was a tiny, stifling box constructed of raw-oriented strand board. She shared it with 2 other women who were currently out on a night rotation. The room was pitch black, smelling of damp, sour towels and baby powder. The window AC unit rattled violently in the wall, fighting a losing battle against the ambient desert heat. She stood in the center of the dark room. The silence was deafening, a heavy pressure against her eardrums. She reached up and began to unfasten her plate carrier. The Velcro ripped with a loud, aggressive tearing sound. She let the 30-pound vest drop to the plywood floor. It hit with a heavy, dead thud. She pulled the stiff, sweat-caked combat shirt over her head, wincing sharply as the heavy fabric dragged across her bruised and swollen shoulder. She walked over to the small, scratched mirror bolted to the wall above a plastic wash basin. She pulled the chain on the overhead bulb. The harsh, yellow light flickered on. She looked at herself. The woman in the glass looked like a stranger. Her skin was a sickly pale grey beneath the harsh lighting, smeared heavily with dirt, dried sweat, and dark, greasy gunpowder residue that looked like tribal war paint. The 3 butterfly bandages held a dark, jagged line of clotted blood together on her cheekbone. Her eyes were sunken deep into her skull, the whites heavily bloodshot, the irises entirely hollow and devoid of light. She turned on the tap. The water sputtered, running lukewarm. It smelled strongly of chlorine and rust. She cupped her hands, bringing the water up to splash her face. She scrubbed her fingertips into her paws, trying to dig out the grit and the smell of the valley. The water running off her chin and pooling in the white plastic basin turned a dark, muddy brown. She stared down at the dirty water swirling slowly toward the drain. 2 massive gunships, millions of dollars of titanium, steel, and high explosives, dead in the dirt. She didn't feel powerful. She didn't feel like an apex predator, and she certainly didn't feel like a hero. She just felt profoundly, heavily tired. It was the kind of deep, cellular exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. The kind of tired that settled into the marrow of the bones and permanently altered the architecture of a person. She reached out and turned the tap off. The last few drops echoed sharply in the quiet room. She dried her face with a coarse, stiff towel, pulled the chain to kill the single bulb, and lay down on the thin, unforgiving foam mattress. She stared up at the invisible ceiling in the pitch black, waiting for the phantom, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors to finally fade from her mind. If this raw, unfiltered look at the reality of combat resonated with you, don't let the story stop here. The algorithm buries grounded, gritty storytelling, so we need your help to push back. Hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with someone who appreciates relentless, realistic military fiction, and make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next upload. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you thought of Sarah's impossible shot and the heavy toll of the aftermath. Stay sharp, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next one.